lot happening. It's the West Asian crisis. Syria is blowing up. Assad's regime has fallen. There is going to be a new administration in the United States of America. A lot at stake and a lot of implications with all the events that are unfolding. To discuss all that and more, I'm being joined by Jason Isaacson, who is the Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer at the American Jewish Committee. And AJC is known as a well-known advocacy group and has worked a lot when it comes to not just interests of the Jewish community across the world, but also particularly when it comes to India, has worked very closely on India-US relations. Jason, you will be meeting a lot of officials over here. There are particularly important engagements through your visit. Let's just begin with what the change in administration in America means for Indo-US ties.
I think when you start a conversation about Indo-US relations, you have to always say that there's been a trajectory of more and more positive Indo-US relations going back at least 20 years. HAC has been part of that in partnership with our Indian American colleagues to build a stronger basis under that relationship. And we've seen it flower. So I expect the Biden administration, having been a good custodian of this relationship for the last 4 years, that the Trump administration will similarly follow in that path, as it did when President Trump was in his first term, where you saw closer and closer ties, strategic cooperation, the Indo-Pacific title being used in terms of U.S. military interests in this part of the world. I think that on the business side, on the military side, on the diplomatic side, certainly on the economic side more broadly, there will be a real attention paid to strengthening this very important relationship with the United States.
The economic side is very important, Jason, because all through the campaign trails, President Biden focused on India in some of his campaign events. And while on the one hand, he'd praise Prime Minister Modi, on the other hand, he'd also say that we were too kind or too good to India when it comes to trade, that we should have been tougher. And while in India, many, heard the first part, they just missed out on the second. And it does seem like Trump is going to be tough on India when it comes to trade, tougher than the Democrats.
Maybe. It also may be that this is part of the way Donald Trump behaves toward many customers and countries, as he has throughout his business career. Big talk, hoping to create a deal that's in his interest, in the case of the president being the country's interest. So it may be that we'll hear a lot of scary talk about high tariffs and other ways to use various trade mechanisms. He had a very scary statement about BRICS the other day. So I think that's a you could expect something like that. It's all about deal making.
Internally, Jason, you've just come from back home. How is the country looking? We haven't seen such a divisive election, such as this one. Whether it's immigrants, whether if it is false statements about certain communities, including the Haitians. How does it look for the immigrant community in America?
We've been in an ugly period in American politics, and I would say in American civil discourse generally, not just on the political space, but in other parts of our culture. There's a coarsening of the culture, which is of great concern to a small minority, such as we are, any part of our society that is in some ways vulnerable. When the civil rules are somehow eroded, it's dangerous for everyone. So I'm concerned about that. At the same time, we're a democracy. We have institutions that will support the maintenance of our constitutional framework, the maintenance of certain norms, but those norms have been threatened. Social media hasn't helped at all. And the fact that social media is so easily polluted and distorted and perverted is of great concern. The fact that our educational system is not really up to the challenges that it faces. all of these factors in society are very worrisome. However, things are cyclical. We have elections every couple of years. The president and his party won both houses of Congress, although I should say narrowly in the case of the House, and still pretty narrowly in the case of the Senate. And he won the popular vote by a hair. And so you will have for the next 2 years the Republican control of the U.S. government. But there'll be an election in 2 years for the Congress again. It's typical that in a president's term, the opposite party does better in the off-year election. So we'll see what happens. But am I concerned about the health of American society? Yes. And I must also say, as a representative of a community that is vulnerable historically, there has been a surge of anti-Semitism in the United States, as there has been around the world. There are other forms of bigotry that are more prominent on social media than have been in the past. So there's a lot to worry about, a lot for us to work on in partnership with our Indian American colleagues. But I'm confident that the American system will provide us the tools to combat these challenges.
But Jason, when it comes to the Jewish community particularly, President-elect Donald Trump has been rather on the side of not just the community, but particularly Israel. And we'll come to the larger aspect of that. But his statements on whether if there's anybody who makes an anti-Semitism remark or seems like has an anti-Jewish leaning, does not have space in America. He said it in so many words. So isn't that maybe for those from AJC or from the community at least to heave a sigh of relief?
Look, Donald Trump has a history of being quite outspoken against anti-Semitism. In his first term in office, his anti-Semitism envoy at the State Department, Ilan Carr, was active around the world in combating anti-Semitism and raising warning signs about this. Absolutely. And President Trump himself, on numerous occasions, has reached out to the Jewish community. At the same time, he has also said very harsh things about other minorities. And so there's a kind of a toxic environment that's been created in the United States. It's not just attributable solely to him by any means, but he's been part of a trend of political figures and social figures generally who have tested the bounds of sort of civil discourse on matters of bigotry, on matters of hate, on the rights of minorities. Do I have confidence that Donald Trump in his second term will continue to wage war against anti-Semitism as he did in his first campaign, his first term in office? I am confident about that. I know that there is a great deal of, there's growing support in the Jewish community for President Trump. It's still probably a minority if you look at the election results that we just had a couple of weeks ago. But he will be sensitive to the concerns of a vulnerable Jewish community, one that has known an increasing, a rise of anti-Semitism over the last year especially, but over the last several years. What we can do about this, in social media, there could be restraints put on various comments where some of the filters have been released by Twitter, now called X. They don't control things as much as they used to. Other social media platforms are also more relaxed in combating a rise of bigotry online. Our education systems, our universities have to be much more aggressive in combating rises of hate generally, but also anti-Semitism specifically. We need more partners. We need more partners in cultural space, in the religious space, in the political space. In the Biden administration, there was a very aggressive effort to develop a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And that strategy came out about a year and a half ago. My organization, the American Jewish Committee, played a role in helping to formulate some of these plans. It's an all-government approach to combating anti-Semitism, develop action plans, have coordinators. Make it a point when you hear things that are said or when there are actions that are taken, attacks on synagogues or Jewish community centers, say something. The leaders have to speak out. We're seeing more of that now than we ever saw several years ago. But it's an ongoing effort. It's an ongoing struggle. And when you have particular minorities that are targeted in some way in the course of a political campaign, it makes a lot of people nervous. I want to see a consistent approach to combating hate generally from the Trump administration. We're expecting that. We'll work with the administration to make sure that happens.
Right. Do you think President Biden, or the Democrats particularly so, were not really able to tell the people of America the accomplishments of the administration, like really send that message across, what has been accomplished, and Trump was in an advantageous position because of the lack of strategy and planning by the Democrats?
I mean, if you're asking why Kamala Harris lost the election, there are a number of factors. The fact is that although inflation has been tamed in the last couple of years, if you look at where we were 4 years ago to where we are now, for many factors, because of the pandemic, because of supply chain problems, because of the war in Ukraine, for a lot of reasons, prices went way up. The fact that the rate of increase has been actually quite moderate over the last couple of years didn't register when you're still paying more now than you were paying 4 or 5 years ago. And this was a point that was hammered again and again by the Republican campaigns for Congress and especially for president. The pictures of people streaming across the southern border that were played again and again on TV and on social media were obviously a huge factor and capitalized on. Even though the link between crime and immigration has been established as not the link that the campaign was saying, nevertheless, the impression dug in the minds of many voters that criminals were on the loose in American cities, and it was because of the immigration surge. Yes, immigrants commit crimes. Actually, it turns out, if you look at the data, not as much as Native Americans commit crimes, American citizens commit crimes. But nevertheless, if you point out a few of these incidents, you can scare a lot of people. So that was part of the factor. Another part, of course, was the fact that President Biden was clearly not registering with American voters. He seemed feeble, and he behaved, horribly in that debate against President Trump. And it took him a long time to register that he had to leave. And it took a while for the whole party machinery to kind of get that message across to him. And then you had a campaign of not many more than 100 days for Kamala Harris to suddenly become this popular figure. I mean, the fact that she ended up where she was, I suppose, remarkable given the strikes that were against her. And even though the campaign tried to distance her to some degree from the failings of the Biden administration, failings really in not finding a way to explain the accomplishments that it made over the last couple of years with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the climate change measures were significant. The investing in chip manufacturing, so many things that were done, they weren't able to figure out a way to take credit for it. So she didn't have that, and she had the baggage of being part of an administration that was increasingly unpopular. People thought the United States was on the wrong track, and she lost because of that.
But is that the only reason why, or is America still not ready for a woman president?
I like to think that's not the reason, but I can't dismiss that as a factor. As a woman president, a person of color, it's entirely possible that played into the minds of certain voters, and you don't need a whole lot of voters in a whole lot of states to make the difference in an election like ours. So I can't say it was a non-factor. I think the biggest factor, though, was the fact that Americans generally thought that we were on the wrong track. And the fact that you had a vice president from an administration at the time when people had that impression was a huge disadvantage that you just could not get over.
Okay. Let's just zoom out a little and talk about Israel and where it stands today and where it could head post January 20th. President Trump has already warned Hamas and the other organizations that should they continue to support and not release the hostages, they would have hell to pay.
Yeah.
That's a serious shift from trying to get them to the negotiating table. What's your reading on how things are going to look in West Asia from the 20th of January?
I'm afraid that on the 20th of January, it won't look so very different from the way it looks on the 9th or 10th of December. It's possible that the negotiations that have taken place that every now and then we're hearing are moving closer and closer to completion for a hostage release deal, for a ceasefire deal, may actually be accomplished. But I have my doubts. I mean, after all, holding onto the hostages is the one card that Hamas has. Why they would release that one card, knowing that it'll mean the end of their governance in Gaza, I don't know how it makes sense for them. It makes sense for the world and it makes sense for humanity, but I'm not sure that it makes sense to the hardened terrorists supported by Iran that is represented by the leadership of Hamas, the existing leadership of Hamas, the weakened leadership of Hamas, but they're not gone. They're still there. So I'm hoping that we'll be in a different place, but I'm not sure at all that we'll be in a different place. We may be in exactly the same place. As far as other fronts, though, the fact that you now have the fall of the Assad regime is hugely significant. It is at least as significant as the end of the Mubarak regime, the end of Gaddafi.
But it's not a takeover from Syria. Is not going to become a republic.
No, that's the problem. I mean, it's so difficult at this stage. We're a couple of days after the fall of Assad, after his evacuation to Moscow, to really assess how you kind of tease apart the different threads that are part of this coalition of forces that have overtaken the Assad regime. So you have al-Qaeda rooted rebel factions. You have a few democratic forces. You have the Kurdish forces. Obviously, Turkey has played a role in this, so obviously not in parallel completely with the Kurdish forces. So many different competing forces, all wanting very much to depose Assad, but not necessarily agreeing by any means on what form of governance will take place in Syria after that.
And certainly will not be securing Israeli interests because
it's so unclear.
Nobody over here sides with Israel in this part of the world. So,
no, true. However, it must be said that Israel is able to take advantage of the fact that the Syrian army no longer exists. Therefore, its bases were not protected. Therefore, Israel could destroy the offensive capabilities of the previous regime and possibly a future regime. So that is good news, that you will not have the threat posed by that kind of military infrastructure that was controlled by Assad and his family and his cohorts. But what that will mean if you have an Islamist force on Israel's border, what it will mean if President Erdogan of Turkey, who has had very harsh rhetoric, very aggressive rhetoric against Israel, is now supporting forces that are on Israel's border. Will there be any further implications of that? A lot of questions that we have to resolve. What you can say today is that the fall of Assad is a good thing. The end of the 50-plus year Assad regime is a good thing. But what will follow remains in doubt.
What's also interesting is that Trump tweeted about it or posted it on X about the entire event unfolding, and he said that Russia has left or abandoned Assad and Syria, only to later learn that Assad was actually finding home in Moscow.
Look, the fact that Iran no longer has another base in its axis of resistance against Israel and against the West, that's a good thing. If this in some way weakens the influence that the Iranian regime has, which has implications for your country, implications for my country, implications for Israel, that's a good thing. The fact that Russia has lost maybe its base on the Mediterranean that it has wanted for a very long time and has had for decades, that's a good thing.
But in terms of foreign policy, another very important aspect would be how Trump is going to deal with the Russia-Ukraine war and NATO. A pullout, and we're seeing a lot of weapons being sent, which should have been done long ago, Jason. That Biden administration slowed down that process, and now is it an act of desperation allowing long-range weapon systems to be used by Ukraine at this point in time?
Look,
when you already know you've lost the election.
I'm sorry that didn't happen earlier. It should have happened earlier. I can understand the hesitation on the part of the Biden administration. We do not want to run the risk that Putin would follow through on his threats to resort to using nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, in the case of Ukraine. However, how much of that was bluff and how much of it was reality, and whether America should not have been so timid as to prevent Ukraine from using the weapons that it was being provided for going after Russia on its own soil to kind of push back against the offensives of Putin. it's not. I'm not comfortable with the way we ended up. It would have been better to have been more aggressive earlier on, frankly, much earlier on. This war has been going on for almost 3 years at a great cost. But will a new Trump administration put pressure on Zelensky to accept a deal that will cede a quarter of his territory or some significant portion of his territory to an aggressive Russia that invaded a sovereign country without provocation? I hope not. I hope that that's not the way this ends up. It would be a terrible signal to the West, a terrible signal to Europe. I was recently in the Baltic states and in Poland, and I know the feeling there about the possibility that there can be an abandonment of the commitment to protecting the sovereignty of Ukraine, because if the sovereignty of Ukraine is violated in this way, and then at the end of the day there's pressure for a compromise that cedes part of the territory of Ukraine to an aggressive Russia, what does that mean for Moldova? What does it mean for other countries in that region, for the countries that are part of NATO even?
Yes.
Would Putin be so willful, so aggressive that he would decide to take that kind of action against other states, particularly NATO states? So I'm hopeful that the admission of 2 Nordic states into NATO, again, tips the balance a little bit. The fact that you have Europe that's much more conscious of the need to provide more money for their own defense also sends a signal to Moscow. But I'm really hopeful that the second Trump administration will, consistent with the Biden administration and frankly the will of, I think, a majority of the American public, not allow Putin to have a victory.
I thought it's the other way around. A lot of people, and war was one of the reasons
they don't want the
why
war.
Democrats,
no one wants the war. But if you ask Americans,
but if you don't send the money and the aid to Ukraine, then they are going to lose.
Yes.
Trump.
But if you ask Americans if they want
Putin
to win in Ukraine, they will say no.
Yes.
And because if Putin wins in Ukraine,
but not at the cost of their own livelihood.
No, we have not put boots on the ground because America doesn't want to do that anymore.
Or standard of living, because that's what the Republicans have done, Jason. They've actually told the voters that your money is going into wars. You could have had a better standard of life.
That there is a growing faction of the Republican Party that's made that point in Congress and on the campaign trail. There are still hard-nosed, defense-minded, I think quite thoughtful members of the Republican Party in the Congress and the House and the Senate both, as well as people who will be around President Trump, who recognize the need to protect Western interests and protect the security of Europe and the integrity of NATO. And you cannot have a secure NATO if you have a country on NATO's border threatened in this way.
But can he pull out? Will he? Is that a possibility?
It is a possibility. I very much hope it will not be the reality, and it's something that my organization and I think a lot of thoughtful Americans will push back against.
Final question to you, because it's very interesting. We're seeing names come up every other day. The picks of President-elect Donald Trump for his cabinet and his administration.
Interesting selections.
Interesting selections.
I think a thoughtful...
Are they being just rewarded, or is there substance and strength
it's a real mix. It's a real mix. It's fair to say that the National Security Advisor appointment of Congressman Mike Waltz, the Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Senator Rubio, mainstream Republican voices, no surprises there. There are some other appointments that are more controversial and frankly puzzling. Bobby Kennedy Jr. as the Health Secretary, a guy who's against vaccines.
But I think that was that's the messaging here.
It's peculiar, but there are other aspects of the Bobby Kennedy resume that are less troubling, that have to do with healthy food. So how that all gets sorted out is going to occupy
Jay
a lot of time.
Bhattacharya, Tulsi Gabbard,
and the
Kash
defense
Patel,
secretary, yes, Kash Patel.
Peter Hegseth,
Yeah.
David,
And the influence of Elon Musk, which is an unusual factor.
And the
in
NASA head now, all billionaire picks.
Yes. So
how will they run the government? How are they going to run this administration, Jason?
Look, obviously the president wants to surround himself with people who are loyal to him. and people who he's comfortable with. And a president does have the right to have a cabinet of his choosing, people who he has confidence in and who he can count on to carry out his policies. These people have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And the Senate traditionally has vetted nominees. There's been a background check by the FBI, even if you have a possible appointment as head of FBI who is skeptical about the FBI, and there have been a lot of
and
charges,
has questioned the
has
FBI.
threatened to basically shut it down.
Yes.
We're going through a complicated period in American politics, let's face it. You talked at the very beginning of our conversation about the polarization in America, and the distrust in government, which has been part of this whole mantra that has led to the rise of President Trump, a businessman who waltzed in from outside and became the president of the United States, and then was defeated and then ran again,
and won
better than the last
handsomely.
time. So we'll see. All I know is America has had for almost 250 years a successful run as a democracy. But not without periods of enormous crisis. I mean, we had a civil war. Americans were at each other's throats. We're not there now, but there are divisions in our society, and we can't mask them. We're open for all the world to see and to criticize, and also to admire, because there's also great strength in America, American institutions, American culture. So I'm confident that we'll figure out a way through this, but it will be a rough ride.
Okay, and I know I just said final question, but
we will continue to be close to India. There's no question.
I was just going to say that. So what are your expectations from this visit? From this visit?
We are the two greatest democracies in the world. We have had increasing recognition in our society, and I think in this society as well, of the benefits of that kind of partnership in culture, in the economy, certainly in security, but increasing alignment. And India is a great country, and it will insist on and deserves its autonomy strategically. But it is also a valued, prized partner of the United States in so many sectors. And that partnership will grow, and it will be strengthened by, frankly, my small community and partnership with the Indian American community, which is small and growing. And we will continue to work together to make sure that our fellow citizens in America recognize the enormous value of this relationship.
Do you come with any proposal or plan for the coming year?
Other than coming to India as often as possible and working as closely as we can with our Indian American friends on a whole range of issues that fight hate, that encourage understanding of the depth of this relationship, the importance of the relationship. I also, frankly, want to continue to work with our Indian American partners to strengthen the India-Israel-U.S. relationship, which offers so many benefits to all three countries, as well as increasingly, as you know, through IMEC and I2U2, bringing India into the Abraham Accords space as well. And that's something that my organization, AJC, has been very committed to.
Okay. On that note, Jason Isaacson, thank you so much for joining us here on
Good to be with you again,
Geeta.
Geeta.
Thank you.